Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be on surplus value. Recently, I got a user comment asking me about what about surplus value when I was talking about capitalism and the issues where people really don't understand capitalism, and I, I want to sort of get people away from the way Marxist theory thought of capitalism. Because Marx had a tendency of really misunderstanding how economics worked. Uh, it's just the way it is. He's a bit of a goof. So I kind of want to bring it back to explaining how capitalism actually works compared to the way Marx perceived capitalism, because he really didn't understand a lot of the basic elements of capitalism. So first of all, what is surplus value? And I want to use Marx's definition so that I can sort of counter his definition. So Marx defined surplus value as the following. I'm going to read this. Surplus value is equal to the new value created by workers in excess of their own labor cost, which is appropriated by the capitalist as profit when products are sold. Now, what does that mean? So, now, for Marx, the price of an object, whatever it is, the value of that object, whether it be like sliced bread in the store or whatever product it is, was based on the labor in that product. So if you can imagine, when I, as a worker, produce that product, I'm adding value to that product. Okay, so and that seems like a reasonable thing to think. There's a cost associated to people doing the work to make that product, so that must be part of the value of the product. Pretty logical, sounds reasonable, but it isn't. Strangely enough, doesn't work that way. And for Marx, the labor had intrinsic value based on how many hours they worked, how much education they received, their whole background. All that contributes to how much that person's labor is worth, and their talents and so forth. All of that. So that person has a value, and their labor has a value. And the capitalist, in Marx's opinion, was basically saying, okay, we know that the value of that laborer is X. And in order to make a profit, I have to charge X plus something. And that's my profit. That something is the profit. And that equals the surplus of value. That the profit that we get from this labor beyond how much that labor is worth is the surplus value. So the value is this surplus value, in a long-winded way, is really just another way of saying profit. Because we know that according to Marx, the product has a certain amount of labor, and that labor has an intrinsic value, and therefore that product has an intrinsic value. And anything above that intrinsic value is what is called surplus value. And that's where the capitalist is making their money. They're exploiting the worker in order to get that surplus value. And the goal of the capitalist is to obtain as much surplus value. And the thing for Marx is that what happens is, the way he saw it is that in order to maximize surplus value, you must, since there's only two elements to the equation, there's like profit and the value of the labor. So if you think about it, well, where can you get your profit? You basically, and that's your surplus value. So, so what happens is, to maximize your profit, you have to minimize your labor value. And the only way you can do that is you pay your workers less, according to Marx. So what happens is their value is worth maybe $100, let's say, just give a number. But the capitalist is exploiting them, so he pays them $50. So that's the way Marxists think, because the only way you can maximize your profit is to minimize your labor value. Sadly, though, it doesn't work that easily. The way capitalism works, it has nothing to do with the value. Like a product has nothing to do with the actual labor. And that seems like counterintuitive, because you think, well, it costs so much to make that thing. And I'll give you a really easy example of why the value of a product is not connected to the value of the labor. And you've got to think of it this way. Value is subjective. Value is actually not determined by the labor. It's not even determined by the materials in the product. It's not determined by anything that goes into that product. It's determined by the market. The market says, I want to pay this much for it. And they could pay a huge amount more or a huge amount less. It's sort of like, there's the story of the man in the desert. And he's starving, dying of thirst. And he's given the option. Here's like a ton of gold. You could have all this gold or a liter of water. And you'd be like, well, anywhere else you'd want the gold, right? Because the gold is intrinsically more valuable, right? That's what we think. We think gold is super valuable. But in the case of this man in the desert, well, in this case, he's going to die of thirst. So he's going to choose the water. And that's the subjective value. So the market, which is this man in the desert, he determines that water is worth more than gold. So even though, to get that gold it's a really rare element, so it's a very valuable material. Maybe it took miners and lots of workers to mine all that gold. And, there's a lot of labor cost associated to that gold. But at that moment, the market has decided that all of that work, all of that stuff that goes into that producing that gold is worth less than the water. And that's how the markets work. They're subjective. They don't appreciate all that work, all that material cost, all that labor that went into producing the product. They only appreciate the product, and they determine how much that product is worth. So it's kind of counterintuitive to what Marx would think. So the problem is Marx really wanted to, the center of Marx's universe was the worker and the whole idea of empowering the worker. So that's why he kind of maybe deliberately misunderstood capitalism in order to say, hey, let's put the worker at the center of the value of the product, rather than understanding that the worker and the material, everything is not really associated to the value of the product. It's the market. And that's true capitalism. Capitalism is about the market. The market is what determines everything. And the market can be up or down, and it can be all over the place. So when a capitalist thinks of things, they think about two kind of elements. They think about pricing, and they think about what the market is going to give in terms of that pricing. So when they like a capitalist determines pricing, the labor value actually comes into play. So they would say, well, okay, I have to think of my raw costs. Well, my raw costs are my materials, my labor costs, my housing costs, or whatever it is, that all the things that go into making that product. And that's how I determine my pricing, because if it costs me $90 to make that product, and I have to sell it at more than $90, or I'll lose money. And so what ends up happening is they sell it at $90. If they sell it at $90, they'll go out of business. So they sell it at $100 now, or they sell it at $200 even, like trying to maximize the profit. They try to charge as much as they can. However, competition comes into play. And all of a sudden what can happen is the market says, well, there's lots of choices out there, and there's even better choices than your choice. And maybe instead of paying $100, they're only willing to pay or $200 that you wanted to charge. They are only willing to pay $50. All of a sudden, all those costs that you have that are fixed, you can't make a profit on. You'll actually lose money every time because it costs you 90 and you're only going to be getting paid 50. Now, profit is actually a magical thing, because what it does is it protects you when things go weird in the market like that. Like, as I said, they're willing to pay less than it costs to make it. And it protects you because you basically now have this buffer that you can use to protect yourself when things go bad. But also it's an inspiration. So what I mean by inspiration is that the goal is to seek profit. And if you are in a situation where all of a sudden you say, well, okay, it cost me $90 to produce something that I can only sell for 50, then you have to figure out how to get from 90 down to 50, where you can still make a profit. And under Marxist theory, you would just, because they only have those two factors within the equation, they think, well, of course they're going to just screw over the workers. They're gonna pay the workers less. That doesn't actually happen. Funny thing is, they don't actually pay the workers less. They actually sometimes even pay the workers more. And you're like, well, what the heck? That doesn't make sense. If you pay them more, well, then you're going to be even more screwed. It's going to cost you 100 or 200. It doesn't work that way. Workers are changing. They change in terms of their ability to produce. Okay, so what you can do is you can give them better equipment. You can train them. You can do things to reduce the labor costs without actually having to pay them less. So what you can do is you get that value of labor, where instead of it's sort of like the Ford Motors. When they originally produced cars, it was very expensive. they had, like, a team of guys working on a car, and they would each do they would each work on the car and put things together, and it was very disorganized in a way, and it was very slow, and it took them it was a huge amount of time and to produce a car. But then Ford said, okay, well, let's get them each doing a small task, but over and over again. And he was able to reduce the labor costs and produce more. And that wasn't because the labor became any more savvy or skilled or anything like that. They were just given through the entrepreneur's insight. They were used in a different way, and in order to reduce the costs of that labor, or to make it so that that labor was more efficient. And that's what profit drives. It drives efficiencies, and it drives innovation, where you find ways of improving how that labor works. And it doesn't mean that labor is working like 100 hours a week. No, they're probably working the same number of hours, and they might be even working easier hours, but they are able to produce more. It's one of those weird contradictions about capitalism. You don't have to actually pay your labor less. You don't have to treat them any worse. You don't have to abuse them, have a whip over them, and drum beating. You don't have to do any of that, but you can still produce more with the same labor. It's pretty amazing, and it's because of the fact that capitalism encourages innovation and creativity to drive profit. And it's that the thing with capitalism is, when there's lots of competition, often what ends up happening is the price actually goes down. And that's the really amazing thing about capitalism, Whereas under socialism, you really don't have that that capability because everything's owned by the government. There is no incentive to work any harder or smarter or anything. You just produce what you're told to produce, and there's no market pressure to force you to be more creative or more innovative about producing more or better or cheaper. There's just no pressure there. And that's the brilliant thing about the market. The market and the profit motive really drives the innovation. So this is how Marx sort of got it wrong. He didn't really understand how capitalism works, and a lot of socialists don't. They see it as this very simple equation of surplus value, which is really just the value of labor plus profit equals surplus value, and that's all there is to it. And the only way to make a profit and to survive as to make this surplus value is to really exploit the worker. Doesn't work that way. Just doesn't. And if you run a business, like I've run several businesses over the years, I actually pay my workers more and more. I remember one employee, like I wanted to hire somebody local, and I couldn't do it because stupid minimum wage was like really, really high. And it was like $10 an hour, which, or it was actually maybe even less. It was like $8 an hour. Now I could hire somebody overseas for about $2 an hour. Okay. And that was actually skilled labor. So, over time, that worker now is $12. I could hire the same worker here locally for $10. So I'm actually paying somebody overseas more than a starter worker here. And the reason being is that worker overseas has become trained and they've become more skilled, and they've increased their value to where I can pay them more. And I pay them more because not because I'm an idiot. I pay them more because I want to retain their labor, because if I don't pay them more, they're so skilled now that they will be able to go somewhere else and demand more than I would, if I'm trying to rip them off. They'll be able to demand more from somebody else. But I pay them the right amount because I can figure out that right amount. And they, as a result, they remain loyal to me, and it's a win-win. So generally, the cost of labor may go up over time, which is kind of counterintuitive to capitalism. Like they always tell you, all these evil capitalists are always trying to exploit their workers, but that's not true. It's just not true, because capitalists understand that labor is essential. And if you screw over your workers too much, or you don't pay them enough, they will leave. And the cost of getting new labor can exceed the savings that you might have had by just trying to exploit cheaper labor. Now, there are ways that labor costs can go down through not exploitation, but through seeking labor from other areas. A lot of the people on the left, they always say that they're out for the workers. They're always trying to promote the fact that they're trying to help the common man and the working class and all this kind of stuff. And that's a bit of a lie. I want to call out the left for lying on that, because often what they'll do is they'll promote things like open borders. They'll promote things like mass immigration, and those are the circumstances where you can have labor costs go down in a way that is not necessarily fair, where you can force labor that is cheaper to come in. So what happens is, like, if you bring somebody from India, as an example, I have nothing against India, I'm just picking India. Well, their cost of living in India is fairly low, and their education costs are low compared to here. Going to university here is going to cost you a few $100,000. So you have that huge upfront cost as as a laborer, like a worker, has that huge upfront cost, and they can't work below that what they need in order to pay off their debts, in order to survive. So they're sort of fixed where they can't go below a certain threshold, because they'll just go at they just won't be able to survive because they're crushing debts. Okay, well, they bring in somebody that has like a fraction of that debt. Like, you could probably get somebody who has maybe like less than 100,000 in debt, or not less than no less than $10,000 in debt, and they come over here and they're competing with people who have maybe 100 or 200,000 in debt. Well, they can work for a lot less, and they're used to living on a little bit less, so they're willing to work for much lower prices. And so what happens is, with immigration, you generally can reduce the cost of labor. And that's unfair to the local local laborers who had to endure much heavier costs in order to get to the same point. So you can basically make your own internal labor market non-competitive. And it's a brutal thing. It's a really unfair thing that that we do to our laborers, where we have them basically compete in a way that they can never win. So this is one of the lies of the left. If the left was truly pro-labor, pro like the working class, they would be very against any kind of immigration, because immigration generally, as I said, it's a supply and demand thing too. There are more laborers. There's a reduction of how much the companies can pay those will pay those workers, because there's just so many workers, and it reduces the cost of that labor. But also you're bringing in labor that is willing to work for less. So there's a huge downward pressure on the cost of labor within the local economy. So if you're a pro working class person, well, you should be very anti-immigration. Now, if you're an evil capitalist like myself, like, I'm just joking, then you would be very pro-immigration. You'd want as much immigration as possible just to drive down those costs and exploit your workers as a good capitalist should. And you would just push that labor cost to as low as you can. And so this is the way capitalism works. And this is the one case where you can see some kind of unfair exploitation of the worker, but I don't really believe in that necessarily, that it's true exploitation, because people, the capitalist is just taking advantage of those silly rules that allow for mass immigration. They are not the ones that are doing the exploitation necessarily. It's really the government. And this is why I'm very pro small government, less government involvement, less government involvement in actually immigration. Try to keep immigration to a minimum, even though I'm a capitalist and I could benefit from cheaper labor locally. I actually want the government less involved, because I actually want to see my own country do better. I want to see the individuals in my country do better. And if you have too many people coming in, it generally doesn't help the local population. Just one quick note on that concept as well. One of the tricks, and I'm a little bit off topic, I realize that. I was talking about surplus value, but now I've gone into immigration. But I kind of want to address this one point. One of the tricks that the governments do in order to encourage the idea that, oh, we need more people, is they always talk about GDP. And this is one of those things that most people don't even know what GDP means. Well, GDP is your gross domestic product. And that's really how much is the whole country producing. So if the whole country as a whole, working all together, let's say, I like to keep numbers simple. Let's say there's 10 people in the whole entire country. And those 10 people produce $100 as their gross domestic product. Okay? Now, if you bring in another 10 people, okay, and those extra 10 people can produce 5 extra dollars of GDP, like gross domestic product, well, then your country has grown. It's gone up to 15%, $15. So you say, wow, look at how immigrants are enriching our country, where our gross domestic product is higher. Okay, and this is the trick the governments always do. They always talk about how the gross domestic product has gone up. However, what they didn't notice, they ignored, is now there's 20 people in the country, using the numbers I'm saying, and the gross domestic product is 15. So the average person is actually making less. They're making, instead of $10, how much they're contributing only $7.50. So the average person is actually worse off. And this is one of those tricks that they never talk about in the government. But the reason the government is focused on gross domestic product rather than individual wealth, individual success, is if you're in the government business, and the government is a business in its own way, you care more about gross domestic product than you do about individual wealth. Individual wealth doesn't mean anything to you because you're a tax business. Your business as a government is to tax people. And the more people you have and the more gross domestic product you have, the more tax revenue you can generate. And another bonus is if you bring in people from the third world or from wherever, they'll usually vote for you. So you can not only maintain your control of this government business of taxation, but you can actually bring in more people, especially under a democracy, that will ensure that you remain the government in power over this business. It's a pure scam. So never let these subtleties pass you by where you really don't understand the impact that the government has and the motivations behind the government in terms of why they create these policies. Their goal is not to benefit the average person. Their goal is to stay in power and to increase their power. And the only way that they can do that is bring in voters and bring in people who are going to increase that gross domestic product, that number. They don't care about what it really means. They only care about that bigger number. So though this video is about surplus value, I know it kind of went on a tangent. I hope that it kind of makes you understand how Marxist theory kind of allowed for these kind of weird government issues to happen, where they focus on something that's not really the issue, and in order to serve their own interests. And if you focus on pure capitalism, and the society would be much better off. Often it's the governments that cause the problems. And I hope that this is all clear. I hope that you understand why surplus value doesn't work the way like Marx described. And it really, you gotta just make it simple. Just realize Marx is wrong and that surplus value doesn't work the way he suggests. And that basically value of a product isn't determined by the labor, isn't determined by the materials, isn't determined by anything but the market, what the market is willing to pay. And that's all you need to know. That's any product out there. It doesn't matter what it is. It's always determined by what is the market willing to pay for that product. And you can try to manipulate that market, but generally the market will decide on its own what that product is worth. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, please put them below. Please check out my other videos. And thanks for watching.